second group. Okay, siapa second group? Jom. Saya buka scorecard. Jom. Okey, Mardiah Najwa topik 1 and 2. Sekarang kita pergi ke topik yang kedua. Topik 3 and 4. Asrul dengan Aisyah. Asrul dengan Aisyah topik Conceptual Framework topik 3 and 4. Sebelum tu kalau semua boleh masuk tak dalam saya punya Google Drive? Sekejap saya share. Sebabnya ada yang tak ada orang tanya saya punya Google Drive ni boleh masuk ke tidak. Ada problem tak nak buka Google Drive?
Tak ada, sir.
Semua boleh masuk. Sebab saya share semua dalam tu kan. Okey, saya buka sekejap saya punya. Okey. Ini BFAR3073. Okey. Ni semua saya dah masukkan ya, quiz. Ini BFAR kan. Ini dia punya quiz presentation, Kahoot, course information, scorecard, partial presentation deck, your senior presentation deck. Okay. Yang ni semua boleh dapat share. Anyone on the internet with this link can view. So tak ada masalah. So dekat sini conceptual framework ni banyak ya. Saya dah di topik 01 ni, dia ada semua kat sini. Chapter 2, chapter 1, topik 5 dan 6. Ini pasir paper, semua you boleh check dekat sini. Contoh ya, ini pasir paper Nurhani. Saya buka sikit sebagai contoh. Presentation of pasir paper collection. Okay, jom kita tengok apa soalannya. Internet tak berapa laju. You check balik. Semua ini semua reference you. Presenter pertama Nurhani, Aida Alia Tidayu dengan Raihana. Okay, ini soalan kita. Discuss whether general purpose financial reporting is able to provide all the information needed by the existing potential investor, lender and other creditor. Ini part of the chapter. Oh, ini overall chapter 1, 2, 3 sampai 6 kan? Secretary. Oh, ini yang group yang terakhir tu, yang conclusion. Sampai 37 pages dia buat. Ini dia punya jawapan ya. Saya tak pasti jawapan dia pun salah lagi. So ini dia orang submission dulu. So semua sepatutnya conceptual framework ni semua dah ada idea macam mana nak present. Okay. Okay, jom. Asrul dan juga Aisyah. Asrul dan Aisyah. Jom, present.
Sir, I share the screen.
Yes, share.
Okay.
Okay. Kita based on conceptual framework yang saya dah bagi hari tu ya. So saya akan bagi markah terus. Satu soalan, satu markah. Satu soalan, satu bonus mark. Saya akan bagi kepada orang yang bertanya soalan. Jom. Ingat video you kena record and then you bagi saya. Let's go. Saya tak dengar suara tak? Kat mana dia kena saya letaknya audio ni? Yang lain boleh dengar suara tak? Boleh tak? Dia ada kan? Kat mana dia boleh suara ni? Kat mana? Saya pun tak pasti. Sebab tak dengar suara. Siapa pernah present guna video?
Kena include
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My
Okay,
name is Muhammad Asrul Muhammad Faizal. With my groupmate Nur Aisha binti Fandi, we represent Group 2, representing to you about Conceptual Framework, Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. So, the next slide is, I will start with the Chapter 3. There are 6 components that I will tell you. The first one is objective and scope of financial statements. Second, reporting period. Third, perspective adopted in financial statement. 4, going concern assumption. 5, the reporting entity. 6, the consolidated and unconsolidated financial statement. So I will start with the first one, which is objective and scope of financial statement. The objective of financial statement is to provide financial information about the reporting entity assets, liabilities, equity, income and expenses that is useful to users of financial statement in assessing the prospect for future net cash inflows to the reporting entity and in assessing management stewardship of the entity's economic resource. From the scope view, the information given is in the statement of financial position by recognizing assets, liabilities and equity. In the statement of financial performance by recognizing income and expenses, and in other statement and notes by presenting and disclosing information, which is in C, there are about, which is recognized assets, liabilities, equity, income and expenses, including information about their nature and about the risks arising from those recognized assets and liabilities. Second is assets and liabilities that have not been recognized, including information about their nature and about the risks arising from them, cash flow, contribution from holders of equity claims and distribution to them, and the methods, assumption and judgments using in estimating the amount presented or disclosed and changes in those method, assumption and judgments. So that's all from the for the scope. And the next is the reporting period. Financial statements are prepared for a specific period of time and provide information about assets and equity that existed at the end of the reporting period or during the reporting period, and income and expenses for the reporting period. So, this is to help users of financial statement to identify and assess changes and trends. Financial statement also provide comparative information for at least one preceding reporting period. Information about possible future transaction and other possible future event is included in the financial statements if relates to the entity assets or liabilities, including unrecognized assets or liabilities, or equity that existed at the end of the reporting period or during the reporting period, or to income or expenses for the reporting period. And next is if the financial statement is useful to users of financial statements. For example, I can give is if an asset or liability is measured by estimating future cash flow, information about those estimated future cash flow may help user of financial statement to understand the reported measure. Financial statements do not typically provide other types of forward-looking information. For example, explanatory material about management expectation and strategy for the reporting entity. Financial statements also include information about transactions and other events that have occurred after the end of the reporting period, if providing the information is necessary to meet the objective of financial statement. And the next one is perspective adopted in financial statement. I'm combine these two in one slide because there are only short thing that we will cover. So the first perspective adopted in financial statements. Financial statements provide information about transactions and other event view from the perspective of reporting entity as a whole, not from the perspective of any particular group of the entities existing or potential investors, lenders or other creditors. And for the going concern assumption, financial statements are normally prepared on the assumption that the reporting entity is a going concern and will continue in operation for the foreseeable future. Hence, it is assumed that the entity has neither the intention nor the need to enter liquidation or to cease trading. If such an intention or need exists, the financial statements may have to be prepared on a different basis. If so, the financial statement describe the basis used. And the next one, for the reporting entity, a reporting entity is an entity that is required or chooses to prepare financial statement. A reporting entity can be a single entity or a portion of an entity or can comprise more than one entity. A reporting entity is not necessarily a legal entity. Sometimes one entity or we call parent has control over another entity which is subsidiaries. If a reporting entity comprises both the parent and its subsidiaries, the reporting entity's financial statement are referred to as consolidated financial statement. If a reporting entity is the parent alone, the reporting entity's financial statement are referred to as unconsolidated financial statement. If a reporting entity comprises two or more entities that are not all linked by a parent-subsidiary relationship, the reporting entity's financial statement are referred to as combined financial statements. Determining the appropriate boundary of a reporting entity can be difficult if the reporting entity is not a legal entity and does not comprise only legal entities linked by a parent-subsidiary relationship. In such cases, determining the boundary of the reporting entity is driven by the information needs of the primary users of the reporting entity's financial statement. Those users need relevant information that faithfully represent what is the purpose to represent. Faithful representation requires the boundary of the reporting entity does not contain an arbitrary or incomplete set of economic activities, including that set of economic activities within the boundary of the reporting entities result in neutral information, and a description is provided of how the boundary of the reporting entity was determined and what constitutes the reporting entity. So that's all for the reporting entity. So we move to consolidated and unconsolidated financial statement. Consolidated financial statements provide information about the assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expenses of both the parent and its subsidiaries as a single reporting entity. That information is useful for existing and potential investors, lenders, and other creditors of the parent in their assessment of the prospect for future net cash inflow to the parent. This is because net cash inflow to the parent include distribution to the parent from its subsidiaries, and those distribution depend on net cash flow into the subsidiaries. Net cash inflow to the subsidiaries. Consolidated financial statement are not designed to provide separate information about the asset, liability, equity, income, and expenses of any particular subsidiary. A subsidiary's own financial statement are designed to provide that information, while unconsolidated financial statements are designed to provide information about the parent asset, liabilities, equity, income and expenses, and not about those of its subsidiaries. That information can be useful to existing and potential investor, lenders and other creditors of the parent because first, a claim against the parent typically does not give the holder of that claim a claim against subsidiaries, and in some jurisdiction, the amount that can be legally distributed to holders of equity claims against the parent depend on the distributable reserve of the parent. Another way to provide information about some or all assets, liabilities, equity, income, and expenses of the parent alone is in consolidated financial statement in the notes. Information provided in unconsolidated financial statements is typically not sufficient to meet the information need of existing and potential investor, lenders, and other creditors of the parent. Accordingly, when consolidated financial statements are required, unconsolidated financial statement cannot serve as a substitute for consolidated financial statement. Nevertheless, a parent may be required or choose to prepare unconsolidated financial statement in addition to consolidated financial statement. So that's all for chapter 3. I hope you can understand what I'm explaining to you guys. And the next one is the past year question. We found one from the past year question, one question about chapter 3. So the question is, a conceptual framework is a constitution, a coherent system of interrelated objectives and fundamental that can lead to consistent standard and that prescribe the nature, function and limit of financial accounting and financial statement. Berkawi 2003 P189. So the question is, discuss the purpose of financial statements, and the answer that we suggesting to you guys is, the purpose of financial statement is to provide information about an organization's result of operation, financial position and cash flow. This information is used by the users of financial statement to make resource allocation decision. Each of the financial statements serve a different purpose at a more refined level. There are three major types of financial statement, which are income statements, balance sheet, and statement of cash flow. Sorry, the income statement informs the user about a company's ability to generate a profit. Furthermore, it reveals the volume of sales as well as the nature of the various types of expenses, depending on how expense data is aggregated. It can also be used to analyze trend in the result of company operation when viewed over multiple time period. And next is the balance sheet. The balance sheet purpose is to inform the user about the current state of the business as of the date specified on the balance sheet, such as the company's asset, liability, and equity. This information is used to estimate the company's liquidity, funding, and debt position, and serve as the foundation for a number of liquidity ratios. Last but not least, the statement of cash flow. It is to display the nature of cash receipts and cash disbursement according to a variety of categories. This information is extremely useful because cash flow do not always correspond to the sale and expense shown on the income statement. So that's all for the past year chapter 3. I'll pass to Nur Aisha for the next part.
Thank you, Asrul. My name is Nur Aisha Pandi, and I will present to you guys about chapter 4, the element of financial statement. So under the element of financial statement defined in the conceptual framework are divided under two categories, which are asset, liability, and equity, which is related to a reporting entity financial position, and the income and expenses, which are related to a reporting entity's financial performance. So for the first element, which is asset, asset is present economic resources controlled by the entity as a result of past events. And economic resource is a right that has the potential to produce economic benefits. Under this, we will discuss the three sections under the definition of asset, which are right, potential to produce economic benefit, and the control. Under right, rights that have the potential to produce economic benefit take many forms, include the right that correspond to an obligation of another party and right that do not correspond to an obligation of another party. Many rights are established by contract, legislation, or other similar meaning that similar to contract and legislation. For example, an entity might obtain right from owning or leasing their physical object from owning a debt instrument or an equity instrument. However, not all of entities' right are asset of that entity. The right must both have the potential to produce for the entity economic benefit beyond the economic benefits available to all other party and must be controlled by the entity. In the principle, each of the entities' right is a separate asset. However, for accounting purpose, related rights are often treated as a single unit of account that is a single asset. For example, the legal ownership of a physical object may give rise to several rights such as the right to use the object or the right to sell right over the object. Next is the potential to produce the economic benefit. An economic resource could produce the economic benefit for an entity by entitled or enabling them to do so. For example, by receive the contractual cash flow or another economic resources, exchange economic resources with other party on favorable terms, produce cash inflow or avoid cash outflow of economic resource. Some of the example are exchange. Some of the example are leasing the economic resources to another party. Next, receive cash by selling the economic resource. And last, by extinguish liabilities by transferring the economic resource. Last, for the control links an economic to an entity. Assessing whether control exists helps to identify the economic resource for which the entity accounts. An entity controls an economic resources if it has the present ability to direct the use of the economic resource and obtain the economic benefit that may flow from it. Control also include the present ability to prevent other parties from directing the use of economic resource, which also means that if one party controls an economic resource, no other party could control it. However, for an entity to control the economic resource, the future economic benefit from that resource must flow to the entity either directly or indirectly rather than to another party. So for the next element, which is liability. A liability is a present obligation of the entity to transfer an economic resource as a result of past event. And under liability, in order for liability to exist, there are three criteria that have to be satisfied, which are the entity must have has an obligation, the obligation to transfer an economic resources, and present obligation that exists as a result of past event. So for the first one, the entity has an obligation. The first criteria is the entity has an obligation. An obligation is a duty or responsibility that an entity has no practical ability to avoid. An obligation is always owed to another party. And if one party has an obligation to transfer an economic resource, it follows that another party has a right to receive that economic resources. However, a requirement for one party to recognize a liability and measure it at a specific amount does not imply that the other party must recognize an asset or measure it at the same amount. And many obligations are established by contract, legislation, or any similar means which are legally enforceable by the party to whom they are owed. The obligation can also arise, however, from an entity customary practices, published policy or specific statement. The obligation can arise in such situation and sometimes referred to as a constructive obligation. Next is the obligation to transfer and economic resources. So to satisfy this criteria, the obligation must have the potential to require the entity to transfer an economic resources to another party. An obligation can meet the definition of a liability even if the probability of a transfer of an economic resources is low. And the example of the obligation is obligation to pay cash, to deliver goods or provide service, and to issue a financial instrument. Last is the present obligation that exists as a result of past event. This the third criteria for liability is this, which is exists as a result of past event. A present obligation exists as a past event if only if the entity has already obtained the economic benefit or taken an action of it, and as a consequence, the entity will or may have to transfer an economic resource that it will not otherwise have had to transfer. An entity does not yet have a present obligation to transfer an economic resources if it has not yet satisfied the criteria stated before, which is the entity has an obligation, the obligation to transfer an economic resources, and the present obligation that exists as a result of past event. If it has not yet obtained the economic benefit or taken an action that will or could require the entity to transfer an economic resources that it will not otherwise have had to transfer. For example, the entity does not have a present obligation to pay the salary until it has received the employee's service. Next is the asset and liability. Under asset and liability, there are also three aspects, which are unit of account, executory contract, and the substance of contractual rights and contractual obligation. The unit of account is the right or the group of rights, the obligation, or the group of obligation, or the group of right and obligation to which recognition criteria and measurement concepts are applied. A unit of account is selected for an asset or liability when consider how recognition criteria and measurement concepts will apply to the asset or liability and to the related income and expenses. In some circumstances, it may be appropriate to select one of a unit account for recognition and different unit of account for measurement. And sometimes both right and obligation arise from the same resources. For example, some contract must establish both right and obligation for each of the party. And if those right and obligation are interdependent and cannot be separate, they constitute a single inseparable asset or liability and hence form a single unit of account. Some of the possible unit of account include an individual right or individual obligation, all right, all obligation, or all right and all obligation arising from a single sources. For example, a contract, a subgroup, or those right and or obligation. For example, a subgroup of right over an item of property, plant and equipment, for which the useful life and pattern of consumption differ from those of other right over the item. And last, a group of right and or obligation arising from a portfolio of similar items. As for the executory contract, an executory is a contract or a portion of a contract that is equally unperformed. An executory contract establishes a combined right and obligation to exchange economic resources. The right and obligation are interdependent and cannot be separate. If both parties fulfill its obligation under the contract is no longer executory. And if the reporting entity performs first, it will change the reporting entity rights and obligation to exchange the economic resources into right and to receive an economic resources, which is an asset. And last, for asset and liability is the substance of contractual right and contractual obligation. The terms of a contract create rights and obligation for an entity that is a party to that contract. To represent those rights and obligation faithfully, financial statements report their substance. In some cases, the substance of the right and obligation is clear from the legal form of the contract. In other cases, the term of the contract or a group of series of contract require analysis to identify the substance of the rights and obligation. All terms in a contract are considered unless they have no substance, and the terms that have no substance are called disregard. Terms that have no substance could include terms that bind neither party, or rights, including options that the holders will not have the practical ability to exercise in any circumstance. For equity, equity is the residual interest in the asset of the entity after deducting all of its liability. Equity claims are claims on the residual interest in the assets of the entity after deducting all of its liability. In other words, there are claims against the entity that do not meet the definition of a liability. Different classes of equity claims may confer on their holders different rights. For example, rights to receive some or all dividend if the entity decides to pay, the proceeds from satisfying the equity claim, either in full on liquidation or in part at other times, or other equity claims. Sometimes, legal, regulatory, or other requirements affect particular components of equity, such as share capital or retained earning. For example, some such requirements permit an entity to make distribution to holders of equity claims only if the entity has sufficient reserve that those requirements specify as being distributable. Lastly is the last element that will be discussed are income and expenses. Income and expenses are the elements of financial statement that is related to an entity financial performance. Income is increase in asset or decrease in liability that result in increase in equity other than those relating to contribution from holders of equity claims. Expenses are decrease in asset or increase in liability that result in decrease in equity other than those relating to distribution to holder of equity claims. From this definition of income and expenses, that contribution from holders of equity claims are not income and distribution to holders of equity claims are not expenses. User of financial statement needs those information about both an entity financial position and its financial performance. Hence, although income and expenses are defined in terms of changes in asset and liability, information about income and expenses is just as important as information about asset and liability. I think that's all for chapter 4. We will move on to the passive question. There are two questions that we found which is related to the chapter 4. First is the past year paper, October 2004, in question 3. What is an asset as defined by the MASB proposed framework? An asset is a present economic resources controlled by the entity as a result of past event and from which future economic benefits are expected to flow to the entity. The assets have three essential characteristics of an asset, which are rights, potential to produce the economic benefit, and the control linked to an entity. For example, machinery, account receivable, property, and inventory. The second question is past year paper, October 2006, question 1. Assets are future economic benefits controlled by the entity as a result of past transaction or other past event. MASB proposed framework for the preparation and presentation of financial statement. Explain 3 essential characteristics of asset as mentioned in the definition above. So for the answer, the first essential characteristic of asset is right that have the potential to produce economic benefit in many forms, including the right that correspond to an obligation of another party. For example, the right to receive cash and the right to exchange economic resources with another party on favorable terms. It is also include the right that do not correspond to an obligation of another party. For example, the right of a physical object such as property, plant and equipment or inventory. Such rights are a right to use a physical object or a right to benefit from the residual value of leased object. Usually, many rights are established by contract, legislation or similar means. For example, an entity might obtain rights from owning or leasing a physical object. However, not all of the entity rights are asset of the entity. To be asset of the entity, the rights must both have the potential to produce for the entity economic benefit beyond the economic benefit available to all other parties and be controlled by the entity. Next is the potential to produce the economic benefit. An economic resources could produce economic benefit for an entity by entitling or enabling it to do. For example, produce cash inflow or avoid the cash outflow by using the economic resource either individually or in combination with other economic resources to produce goods or provide services. Using the economic resources to enhance the value of other economic resources or by leasing the economic resource to another party. It can also be produced by receiving cash or other economic resources by selling the economic resource. Last but not least is the control linked to an entity. An entity control an economic resource if it has the present ability to direct the use of the economic resource and obtain the economic benefit that may flow from it. Control also include the present ability to prevent other parties from directing the use of the economic resource, which also means that if one party control an economic resource, no other party could control that resource. However, for an entity to control an economic resource, the future economic benefit from that resource must flow to the entity, either directly or indirectly rather than to another party. That's all from me for the chapter 4. Is there any question?
Okey, terima kasih Asrul dan Aisyah. Yang ni you record awal kan?
Yes, sir. Record
Okey,
smart.
cuba you share you punya slide asal dia.
Slide asal. Boleh sekejap ya, sir?
Okey. So satu soalan, satu bonus mark untuk siapa yang bertanya ya. Okey. Untuk conceptual framework ni kalau you tanya saya lah kan, saya pun tak hafal. Sebab dia memang teori. Apa maksud apa definition asset, apa definition liability, apa definition equity, apa definition income, revenue, apa definition expenses. So dia teori dia, maksud dia kat situ. So you tak perlu hafal, apa yang you perlu adalah you perlu faham dan ambil dia punya key point. So saya pun tak 100% pun faham apa itu conceptual framework in detail satu-satu. Sebab saya bukan macam kind of lawyer punya orang lah. Sebab ini adalah undang-undang dia. Okay. Apa yang you dapat, as long as you dapat sedikit gist tu, chapter 3, chapter 4 ni untuk apa pun dah cukup. Sebab soalan test you, soalan final exam you, dia tak akan tanya in detail macam tu sekali. Kawan you pun dah present dah, UITM pasal paper, dengan dia cuba pasal paper, dia tak ada tanya soalan-soalan yang sebahagian dalam buku ni, soalan-soalan yang you kena jawab tu based on panjang, lebar, semua tu. Okay. Contohnya yang tadi tu, ada satu part tu, yang ni macam it's too complicated for you. Okay, cuba kita go through satu-satu. Okay, chapter 3. Next. Slide dia. Cuba gerakkan dia punya slide dia. Saya nak gerakkan dia punya slide. Next. Request control boleh?
Cuba boleh request ke, sir? Okay.
Boleh, so boleh.
Okay, dah, sir.
Saya exit ni. Okay, sudah. Okey, tak apa. Tak apa, mungkin internet lambat. Ya, kita start dengan slide pertama dulu. Okey, jom. Saya tak boleh nak ni. Okey, slide pertama, jom. Aisyah, cuba kita back to slide pertama tu.
Okay, sekejap Aisyah.
Saya pun tak boleh nak control.
Oh, sekejap.
Okey. Okey, next. Ni semua kadang-kadang you tak faham pun, tapi you ambil idea sahaja. Penting dia. Okey. Ni dia kita ada 6. Okay, next. Okey, ni biasa. Okey. Next. Okey, ni dia cerita pasal reporting period. Normal setahun ni kan kita punya reporting period tu. Period kita nak report tu. Normally berapa lama dia akan cerita lah kat sini. Ni dia nak cerita pasal reporting period je. Teori dia macam mana. Okay, biasanya kalau normal yang kita buat macam SOPL, SOFP tu ialah 1 tahun sahaja kita punya reporting period. So ni nak cerita teorinya di sebalik reporting period tu. Idea kita reporting period biasanya monthly, annually, quarterly reporting period. Maksudnya statement of profit and loss for the financial period ended 31st December 2021. Term tu reporting period. Okay. Next. Next slide. Okay. Ini kita nak buat financial statement tu. So di sebalik financial statement tu ialah information about transaction lah apa semua kan. Okay, going concern issue ni ialah adakah isu sama ada company ni boleh run in a long term. So agaknya ada going concern issue. So yang ni kita kena buat assumption lah company ni boleh run dalam jangka masa yang panjang. Okay, next. Okay, reporting entity. You buat satu company ke, you buat console ke, you ada parent, you ada subsidy, you combine ke semua, dia cerita pasal itu je. So bila dia banyak sangat ayat-ayat yang macam ni, confuse pula tiba-tiba. So ada teori subjek kan. 2 atau lebih entiti, contoh macam tu. Contoh ya, saya bagi satu ya. Tadi saya tutup dah. Okay, satu. Saya save as tadi. Saya share sekejap Saya share sekejap tu. Okay. This one annual report. Contohnya annual report BFAR 2020. Semua boleh nampak annual report ni? So biasanya orang accounting ni dia mesti tahu apa itu annual report. Sebab ini adalah buku you. Ini you pegang annual report ni. Orang account mesti tahu. Semua yang dalam ni semuanya berkaitan dengan accounting. Okay. Ini semua notice of AGM. Ini di Abi Highcom ya. Ini profile, calendar. Ini dia nak cerita pasal reporting. Reporting period tadi tu. Financial calendar. Ini reporting period kita. First quarter, 31st March, second quarter, June, September, December. Ini kita punya period kita. Ini adalah cerita pasal reporting period. Ini cerita pasal reporting entity. Ini the Albert Highcom consists of Media City, Northern Gateway, Highcom University College, the Albert Highcom, Post Malaysia, Post Bakom, Bank Muamalat. Inilah reporting at the end of the day, siaplah consolidated of financial statement itu. Ni reporting. So dia basic, dia pusing-pusing pun dia akan cerita benda-benda dalam annual report ni juga. Indirectly. Contoh financial statement ni, kat sini ada banyak lah. Cerita pasal asset, liability, equity, expenses, income, semua pusing kat sini. Tapi dia based on definition, teori dia kata apa. That's why kadang-kadang subjek accounting teori ni di hujung nanti sebenarnya you tak faham pun. Tapi bila you practice, you buat tu, slow-slow you akan faham. Sebab dia memang apa maksud asset. Contohnya dalam ada tak dia punya financial statement dekat sini? Kita takut saya tak ni sebab dia tebal kan. Tak ada. Okay, risk management, focus and supervise, ni semua accounting. Saya tak boleh buka. Sekejap saya buka kat sini. Report. So you boleh buat sampel ADRB, Sandabi, Petronas, TNB. Gambar-gambar yang besar. 2021 belum lagi lah. Sorry. Dia ada banyak part. Nanti you akan belajar pasal sustainability reporting. Benda-benda semua you kena check. CG report, corporate governance report. Banyak orang-orang accounting ni. You banyak sikit kerja. Lah. Internet saya lambat. Sekejap. Sambung lagi. Cepat. Tadi saya dah download kan? Download. Sampai download. Okey, sementara tu kita sambung lagi. So, kita tengok download. Okey. Sementara dia download kan, saya tak berhenti sekejap. So, saya nak cek sambungan dia ni. Annual report punya sambungan ni. Tak keluar lagi. Okey, sambil-sambil. Saya bagi satu contoh lah. Sementara kita menunggu. Okey, untuk accounting theory and practice ni, ini adalah contoh final exam. Jawapan lah. Ini contoh jawapan lah. Tak boleh nak share ni. Test you pun juga boleh buat macam ni juga nanti. Sebab ni teori subjek. Bila teori subjek, contohnya lah, ni soalan tak ada kan? Bila saya bagi macam ni, saya nak kalau 10 markah tu, dia ada 5 point. Dalam perenggan, contohnya, 5 point. So, you kena asingkan. Okay, key point pertama, apa? So, point dia kat sini. Kalau nampak lah. Sama sikit. Okay. Key point dia kat sini. Apa key? Key point dia. You kena cerita key point tu. Apa yang you nak cerita tu. Lepas tu explanation. Biasanya key point tu saya perlukan 0.5 markah. And then explanation tu complete set 1.5 markah. Full sentence 2 markah. Macam tu. So itu saya punya style lah untuk bila you jawab soalan teori. Lebih kurang 3 baris, 4 baris, maksimum 5. Itu sahaja. 3 hingga 5 baris sahaja. Yang saya perlukan. Lepas tu you kena set markah dia berapa you nak dapat. Okay. Pilih. Set template pun saya akan bagi masa you buat test and then masa you buat final exam nanti. Saya nak tahu apa key point dia, apa point yang you nak explain. Tak pada dalam kotak pun tak apa, masa presentation pun tak apa. Tapi final exam saya nak suruh pada kotak supaya Saya nak you tahu, bila subjek teori, you kena tahu, you kena letak dia punya header tu key point dia. Apa yang nak you cerita. Lepas tu, explanation dekat bawah tu, apa yang nak explain pasal key point tu. Ini yang saya cuba, nak cuba sampaikan dekat sini. Tak boleh lah, nanti kita sambung dengan depan. Dia punya part tu. So, dia pegat tu. Okay, so semua pasir paper, semua tu you jawab macam ni. Test, final exam, semua kita jawab macam ni nanti. Supaya you tahu apa yang nak cerita. Tak adalah macam kat mana key point dia, kat mana point dia 1, point 2, point 3, point 4. Okay, so tak boleh juga buka. Tak apa, kita sambung semula. Back to Aisyah semula. Nanti kalau annual report saya download, okay. Tengok balik. Kita dah download kat sini. Kemudian minggu depan lah. Saya dah tak sini. Tak boleh buat. Dia kena dengan 43, 44, 4. Siapa yang boleh download cepat dekat rumah, you punya annual report RB ni, you boleh share dekat sini. Sebab you kena saya lambat. Okay, sambung semula. Ni cerita pasal reporting entity. Okay, next. Next shot. So actually benda tu tak banyak pun. Tapi sebab teori kan. Dia cerita pasal kita nak, kalau ada parent company, ada subsidiary dengan parent company, kita dapat konsol, kita tak dapat konsol. Apa advantage konsol? Apa disadvantage unconsolidated? Gist tu kat situ je. Tapi teori kan, you create lah 1, 2, 3 apa, full sentence. Okay, next. Next, Aisyah. Okay, ni pasir paper. Dia jawab macam tadi. Okay, macam ni kan. Discuss the purpose of financial statement. So, dia kena ada 5 point. Kena 5 explanation. So, dapat 1 explanation, 2 markah, 2 markah, 2 markah, 2 markah. So, ada 10 markah. You jangan melirik sana, melirik sini, tak perlu. Terus straight. Apa key point dia? Explanation 3 hingga 5 baris sahaja. Sekarang ni untuk kita punya kelas ni tak ada final exam kan? So, you tak perlu hafal. Sebab saya akan bagi soalan tu 2 hari ke 48 jam ke, soalan tu you akan buat. Tetapi saya nak you cari key point dia and then elaboration dia. Macam answer ni dia terlalu general macam ni kan. You kena buat. Macam saya dah settle satu saya nak 1 point 0.5 markah, explanation 1.5 markah, total 2 markah kat tepi. In total ada 5 sahaja. Kalau you nak bagi lebih tak ada masalah, tapi kena buatlah point based on dia macam tu. You highlight, you colourkan merah, you colourkan biru ke, apa key point dalam pernyataan you tu. Okay, next. Okay, ni pun sama. Buat dalam key point. Okay, ini nak cerita pasal asset, liability, equity, income, expenses. Apa definition dia based on, memang based on macam, you panggil apa? Accounting dictionary, kamus kita. Apa maksud asset? Apa maksud liability, equity, income, expenses? You cerita asset ni ada 3 item. Dia kena ada 3. Right, lagi? Next. Kadang-kadang saya tak hafal pun sebab dia memang teori kan. Ini mengajar pun setahun sekali. Okay. Tapi saya lulus Strategic Business Reporting, SBR tu. Tak tahu macam mana saya boleh lulus SCC itu. SBR tu saya lulus. Inilah salah satu chapter dalam SBR, Strategic Business Reporting. Conceptual framework tu ada 1 tahun. So you kena ceritalah kenapa aset tu dilekatkan sebagai aset, kenapa? Sebab kita ada right, kita ada right untuk produce economic benefit. Apa maksud economic benefit tu? Benefit ekonomi tu, ekonomi punya benefit lah. Contohnya kita ada hak untuk kalau macam aset tu, kita beli aset, kita ada hak ke atas aset tu, dan aset tu boleh bagi pulangan. Economic benefit tu macam tu lah, pulangan dia, boleh bagi pulangan kat kita balik. So, lepas right, pergi potential to produce economic benefit tu. Economic benefit tu, kita beli aset, kita beli mesin kita beli mesin lah. Kalau kita buat kek, kita beli mesin kisar semua. Mesin kisar tu dengan adanya mesin tu boleh generate income. Boleh bagi benefit kepada kita dari segi ekonomi. Ekonomi itu dia merujuk pada perniagaan lah. Economic benefit. And then kita ada control. Kita boleh kawal aset kita. Bukan kita pinjam ke apa semua. And then yang tu kita boleh masukkan dalam kita punya non-current asset. Ataupun current asset dekat statement of financial position. So di sebalik apa itu definisi aset. Ni kamus kita lah. Okay, next. Key point ada 3, right? Potential, control. Lepas tu you tulis key point control. Lepas tu 3 baris. 3 hingga 5 baris. Okay, next. So ada teori subjek ya. Macam ni liability kan. Okay, entity ada 1, 2, 3. Obligation, kita boleh transfer economic resources, and then as a result of past event. Ini dia punya key point untuk liability. So macam mana kita nak recognize liability? Contohnya kita buat loan, long term loan, short term loan, kita pinjam, kita beli barang, kita tak bayar lagi kepada vendor, kita ada tanggungjawab untuk membayar. Kena ada tanggungjawab. Kita hutang dekat orang lain, dan kita ada tanggungjawab. Itu kamus kita, definisi liability. Okay, next. Okay, yang ni kadang-kadang you confuse, kadang-kadang you boleh ignore je topik yang ni. Sebab saya nak ajar dia punya the whole conceptual framework tu, sebab yang ni kadang-kadang you confuse. Yang tadi tu apa, yang ni apa. Yang ni dia cerita pasal unit of account. Yang ni saya tak highlight sangat sebab nanti kalau you belajar further nanti you boleh faham sikit-sikit. Dia punya ni. Yang ni you all boleh ignore dulu lah sebab lain soalan pun dia tak akan masuk dalam unit of account ni. Okay, next. Yang tadi tu, yang penting asset liability, apa definition dia untuk degree level. Ini definition equity. Ini kamus you ya. Okay, next. Saya tak explain in detail sebab kita ada 2 presentation. Okay, next. Okay, lepas equity, ada income, ada expenses. Okay, ini contoh-contoh aja yang kita nak. Ini kamus kita lah, kamus oral account. Inilah kamus kita. Kalau kita tengok apa masuk income, apa masuk expenses, ini kita bagi. Okay, ini saya punya. Terus simpan nota ni sebab kalau nanti in future kalau you dah sama belajar, you still akan belajar benda yang sama. Lebih mendalam. Macam saya bila saya belajar CCA, nota ni jugalah sebenarnya pusing pun you akan guna nota yang sama. Okey. Sekarang saya buka kepada soalan. Satu soalan, satu markah. Jom, kalau ada soalan lah. Kalau tak ada soalan, kita sambung dekat second group. Ada soalan ni?
Saya ada soalan.
Okey, soalan ni.
Okay. So for chapter
Nama.
nama Syafiq Reza.
Syafiq. Okay.
So my question from chapter 3 for consolidate and unconsolidate financial statement, what is the main focus between consolidate and unconsolidate?
Okay. Aisyah dengan Asrul. Okay. What is the main? What are
Main
the main
focus
focus
between consolidate and unconsolidate?
Okay. Apa fokus kat situ? Dia nak cerita pasal topik consolidated tu dengan unconsolidated tu. Apa dia nak highlight dekat situ?
Okay.
Okay, boleh sambung.
Okay, thank you Syafiq for the question. So I will answer the question from Syafiq. So in general, which is from in general, not in accounting, an unconsolidated financial statement will treat each subsidiary separately from an accounting perspective, while a consolidated one account for every subsidiary together. So I assume you can watch the slide or the video in the slide number 7, which
Mungkin
is
Aisyah boleh back slide tu.
yeah, Aisyah can turn to slide number 7.
Okay. Boleh? Tak apa, mungkin Asrul boleh ni lah. Boleh discuss oleh Ibu Aisyah.
Okay, sir. So, in the
Ingat
slide,
subjek teori ni subjek yang membosankan.
in the slide number 7, we have mentioned that consolidated financial statement are not designed to provide separate information about the assets, liability, equity, income, and expenses of any particular subsidiary. And about information that provided in unconsolidated financial statement is typically not sufficient to meet the information needs of existing and potential investor, lenders, and other creditors of the parent. So that's the focus for consolidated and unconsolidated financial statement.
Okay, clear Syafiq?
Clear. So far clear to understand, sir.
Okay. So dia nak cerita bahawasanya bila kita buat account report ni, dia ada consolidated financial statement dengan unconsolidated financial statement. Unconsolidated tu separate financial statement. Okay, contoh dia ambil Highcom, dia ada parent company dan dia ada subsidiary. Dan semua tu biasanya kalau berhad company dia kena consolidate. Yang unconsolidated financial statement ni mungkin company-company yang sedang berhad, yang owner dia ada 10 company. Dia tak consolidate. Dia separate lah. So ada advantage, ada disadvantage. Dia. Okay, next soalan. Okay, Syafiq Reza satu markah. Next. Okay, tak ada ya. Okay, ni saya nak bagi markah and then saya punya komen lah. Macam kita tengok big stage semua ada komen kan. So ni subjek teori, so tak boleh nak selalu serius sangat. Okay, you punya slide ni dah macam matured punya slide. Matured ya. Bukan lagi kanak-kanak foundation. You dah matured. You punya slide presentation ni dah macam nak present masa macam orang dah bekerja lah. Which is good. Good lah. You punya dah level semester 7-8 ni. Pasir paper, key point. And then banyak lagi you kena buat key point. And then you kena highlight key point dia. Sebab kadang-kadang you tak faham pun ayat tu. Bila you tengok key point tu, you faham. Okay. So slide presentation ni okay. Good, professional juga sikit. Kena dah mature you punya slide presentation. Okay. So for your slide presentation ni sebagai 4 markah. 4/5. Okay, untuk you punya presentation tu mostly you banyak lagi baca. Saya punya dictionary, accounting dictionary yang saya bagi itulah pasal punya framework. Sebab bila saya baca, saya ada dua screen kat sini. So bila saya tengok kadang-kadang you baca je conceptual framework tu daripada yang saya dah bagi tu. So maksudnya you baca sebab kadang-kadang mungkin you tak faham sangat in detail apa dia punya ayat-ayat tu semua. Tapi not so bad lah. So presentation you saya bagi 4/5. So in total you dapat 8 markah. Aisyah dengan Asrul. Nanti saya inilah saya update you punya markah scoreboard you. So you punya presentation hari ni 8/10. Okay. Nanti kita akan continue for next presentation next 2 week. Keep it up lah punya effort ni. Recording tak ada masalah. Nanti you recording masuk dalam G Drive. Dan saya minta kebenaran part untuk saya simpan dalam saya punya YouTube channel. So you all simpan kat you all punya, saya simpan sebab nanti akan datang you punya junior pun sikit akan guna balik you punya video tu. So bila dalam saya punya YouTube tu, so saya boleh share teruslah link kepada junior-junior you. Macam yang senior you tu, sebelum ni saya tak save dalam saya punya YouTube. So saya tak nak share video diorang. Okay. Nanti video submission tu akan markah lain lah. Ini presentation sahaja. Masukkan slide dalam G Drive, masukkan video dalam G Drive. Okay, thank you Asrul dan Aisyah. Next kita akan pergi ke second presentation, our last presentation for today. Habis presentation kita akan balik soalan suku. Nanti kita akan sambung balik hari Khamis pukul 8 malam. Okay, jom.
Sir, mute.
Okay. Hana Najiha, Siti Shakira Zafira. Jom. Boleh? Jom present. Topik 5 dan 6. You punya dictionary, accounting dictionary you. Okay, jom. Chapter recognition and de-recognition. Kita nak recognize dan kita tak nak recognize balik. Kita nak recognize based on itu, based on ini semua lah. Okay, jom. Chapter 5 and chapter 6. Okay, jom. Faithful representation. Measurement uncertainty. Chapter 5. Boleh? Chapter 6, measurement. Historical cost, current value, fair value. Relevant, faithful lagi. Faithful representation. Ada tak? Ni. Hana Najiha dan juga Siti Shakira. Mana? Ada apa komen dalam ni? Dalam WhatsApp? Ada. Dia ada ni tak? Dia ada prepare buat preparation ke? Ada. Ada atau tidak? Hello, ada tak? Ada suara tak? Boleh
Ada
dengar?
sir, dengar.
Okay, mana your friend? Ada tak presentation yang chapter 5 dan 6? Shakira, ada buat preparation ke untuk you punya topik? Madan Najwa dengan Jauharatul Dini present hari Khamis. Okay, ada tak? Siapa nak present? Okay, tak ada. So presentation kita kalau tak ada, maksudnya kita akan sambung hari Khamis lah. Presentation kita. Sebab tak ada orang nak present kan. Okay, kalau ada masa dah 10:30 lebih kan. Kalau you nak present pun 1 jam lagi. Boleh present tapi macam tak clear. Sama ada Hana Najiha dengan Syakira nak present atau tidak. Okay. Kalau tak ada, kita sambung hari Khamis. Malam pukul 8 malam untuk presentation chapter 1 dan 2, 5, 6, 7, 8. Kita tengok sampai habis tak kita punya pasir paper conceptual. Tapi saya pasti yang professional bodies, certificate MASP, ACCA, MICP itu tak akan sempat lah. So yang tu saya akan adjust balik jadual ni, kita akan proceed sambung. Okay. Kalau tak ada apa-apa lagi, kita akan sambung hari Khamis pukul 8 malam. Till we meet again, see you then. Assalamualaikum. Bye-bye.
Salam, thank you sir.
Thank you,
You are
sir.
welcome. You are welcome.
Thank you sir.
You are welcome. Welcome. Okay, thank you semua. Assalamualaikum.
Sir nak
Waalaikumsalam.
Aduh.
Last
Thank you,
dah
sir.
baru nak
Baru
Nak
nak tanya.
baru nak
Apa tu, Mar?
tanya kenapa saya tak ada dalam Teams.
Mar tanya
Dah
apa?
tak-
Oh.
Ma tak ada dalam Teams. Rasanya se-add yang FIB punya Teams kot.
Oh, dah
Oh.
lama.
Aduh, sen. Tak apalah, cakap lah WhatsApp lah.
Okay.
Lepas tu nak tanya ni sebab macam kan
Aha.
Aisyah rasa dah buat video. Dia kata video markah lain. So nak kena buat video lain.
Tak tahulah. Kiranya kita kan sepanjang sem ni tak ada live presentation lah. Kiranya kita present record macam tu je.
Boleh
Depends
nak
kan?
live. Depends lah. Tapi macam rasa macam malas nak buat live lama.
Oh itulah kan. Oh so
Ah,
better record lah macam tu. Lepas tu kalau kita, rasanya kalau kita submit dekat YouTube video yang sama je kot. Submit tu